Okay, hello everyone and welcome back. And it is indeed the devil you know, the monster in plain sight. And that finale was something else, right? And I think as a script, it wasn't that great, let's just keep it real. But it was the acting that made it great, right? And I'm glad they didn't go with some weird multiple personality or something strange or something weird. Like I appreciate the commitment. I appreciate John's commitment. Like that scene when he threw the key in front of Elena and was like, "There, I left you." I'm like, what kind of savage, ratchet, like what is happening here? Like, is this real life? So, I don't know, like I was entertained. I'm glad it wasn't crazy. We'll go through it, but I don't know, I'm satisfied to be honest. Nicole and Hugh Grant, they kept us kind of guessing till the end. And to be honest, that's why we were all tuned in, right? Like just to kind of watch this masterclass. So the way Hugh Grant played it was like, it's hard, right? Because you're like listening to him and you're like, yeah, okay, maybe it's plausible. And then you're like, wait a minute, this is getting a bit much, right? Like this is getting out of hand. So the episode starts off and basically where we left off, which was good, with Grace finding the hammer in Henry's bag. And they're kind of looking at each other back and forth. And it's exactly as we suspected, right? Like Henry kind of found it and was covering for his father. And right off the bat, Henry says he did it. The reason I covered is because he straight up did it. And they kind of have this emergency meeting with Haley. And more tea comes out and John just keeps lying. But the way he lies, it's like slightly plausible, right? And I think the most spectacular statement he made was that Fernando kind of snuck into this beach house and hid the hammer there, which is like literally impossible. Like, first of all, how would he know to hide it there? And why would he follow you all the way here? And again, he has like kind of a rationale for everything, right? He's kind of like, okay, well, I had an affair with her here. That's kind of how he knew. And you're like, that's gross that you did that, but it seems plausible, right? You're like, maybe. And he's really playing it up, right? Like knowing damn well that Henry probably covered for him. Like he couldn't have been 100% sure that Henry put the hammer through the dishwasher, but you know, he could kind of guess based on their relationship. And so Haley is just trying to cover her ass. She's like, listen, you know, I do not want to lose my job because of these crazy ass people. And she's like, I can't tell you what to do with the hammer. But this hammer was essentially their undoing, right? Like it was kind of the final nail in his coffin. Up until this point, John has been kind of dancing on thin ice. And this hammer, there's just no plausible explanation for it, right? And it's clear that you can kind of pinpoint the exact moment Grace just stopped believing him. And this was when he threw their son under the bus. So they're trying to figure out what to do. And John is just self-preservation, narcissism, all of it comes out. And he really tries to blame his son, right? Like, which suggests that he would not cover for him. And he really just cannot accept that this image is gone. Like, you are not this good doctor. You're not this good guy. And I think that's when Grace said, I'm done with this guy. Like, the fact that he would do that. Because up until this point, Grace thought he was like a good father, like a nice guy. Like worst case scenario, she seems to have like a worst case scenario for everything. But this was kind of broken, right? Like there's nothing that Johnathan wouldn't say or do to protect himself, right? Like the only person he loved is himself. And I think the fact that he threw his son under the bus is what kind of clicked in Grace's mind that, ooh, he is willing to take us all down if it means saving himself. And even his son called him out, right? He's like, I heard what you said. Like, you are really something. Like, you're really going to blame me knowing damn well that you did it. And the son is convinced, right? Like, this is why he's been following the news. That's why he's been kind of hoping that this was a one-off thing. But it could also be that Henry felt guilty, right? Like, maybe a lot of the reason that he was kind of watching all this is kind of hoping somebody would figure it out. Like, it's hard to know. But he was just damn sure, right? Like, there was no hesitation. He's like, he did it. I mean, what can we do, right? And watching Johnathan kind of discombobulate was really interesting. Like, he kind of goes from throwing his son under the bus, you know, to try and kind of find a middle ground with Grace to, like, being this doting father who's like, that was a monster, like, still trying to redeem his image. Like, he's really, like, the way he kind of, like, his personalities are slowly catching up to him. And we finally get to his testimony. And I thought it was really funny that just before we get to his, like, BS, basically, Haley was kind of giving them advice in the car, right? She's like, okay, Grace, you just need to look normal. And as far as Johnathan is concerned, he just needs to let it all show. Essentially, just be the monster in plain sight, right? Like, that's what Johnathan is. Like, don't try to be this good guy now. Like, really show who you are so that people can't believe that this is what they're seeing, right? And that's the whole point of Johnathan. He's so earnest. He's so transparent in his deception that it's kind of hard to believe that someone would be willing to admit to such behavior. You know, it's like, why not just just confess to the murder? Like, he's confessed to everything else. So Haley's advice is also, that was another red flag. She was like, just let it all hang. Like, show the people who you are, and he did. And John's testimony for me was like, it kind of just fits with his personality. He kind of just went on, and he's kind of a wordsmith, right? He's like, maybe I'm a suspect, an adulterer, blah, 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 but a murderer, that I don't deserve that label. And if you look at the female jurors, they're all kind of looking at him like he's this attractive dude, like, yeah, maybe I would have an affair with him. And he kind of regurgitates his story, right? Like that he was at the scene of the crime, he didn't kill her, and the reason that he fled was because it would look bad, right? Like he would never do such a thing because he loved her. And to be honest, it kind of works, right? Because his whole kind of premise is that he's a doctor, and ultimately, like, he saves lives. He doesn't like take lives. Like maybe at his most, he would not do this. And the whole connection he had with Miguel, and like being his doctor and sleeping in the same bed, and like really just trying to show that he's this empathetic guy, like regardless of how he felt, he would never do this. And he's really playing up the good doctor, right? Like maybe he's a scumbag, but at the end of the day, he's fundamentally an honest person. And it's really interesting how we kept getting flashbacks, and these flashbacks keep escalating. So we see him kind of dry cleaning his shirt or taking the blood off his shirt. And at first, to be honest, when I saw this flashback, I assumed because maybe he tried to save Elena. You know what I mean? Like maybe that could have been a reason why he had the blood on his shirt. Like that could have been another kind of, and he could have said that, right? He could have been like, yeah, you know, maybe there was blood on my shirt, but I was trying to, like, I was so shocked, I was in grief, I really loved her, blah, blah. Like he could have made up anything, but the fact that he didn't even try to explain where his tuxedo was, I mean, that was kind of another subtle red flag. But honestly, his testimony did enough. Like some of those female jurors, just they look convinced. After this trial, there's a lot of like things that happen on the show that's not like outwardly told to us. For example, like we still don't know who Johnathan had an affair with, but we can assume it's Sylvia, because after his testimony, I think Grace called Sylvia and she asked if we could go for a walk. And they go for this walk, and I don't know what they talked about on this walk, but I can assume that everything came out, and specifically what unfolds later, right? Like I think after Johnathan threw his son under the bus, Grace was kind of done, and Sylvia's a lawyer, so maybe she was kind of talking to her about a way to kind of set Johnathan up, and that's what I think transpired in that conversation. I think, you know, there's only so much you can control, but if Nicole or if Grace got on the stand, I think she knew that she would throw him under the bus. And they kind of discussed how to do that, like in this conversation. But again, I think a lot of things came out. We didn't hear it, but we can assume. So we get to day 2, and Haley is desperate. She's on thin ice. She knows that she can maybe convince some of those jurors, especially the female jurors. And kind of on impulse, I think she was about to call the officer back. I'm not sure, but then she called up Fernando's son, Miguel, to the stand. And that was like kind of random, because I think she was desperate and she was just trying to figure something out. And she kind of puts him there and she says, I have 2 questions for you. Because again, Fernando's only alibi was his sleeping son, right? Like, according to the police, he was home all day, he was home all night, and the only person who can kind of testify to that is their son. And so she has 2 questions for him. She says, first, how long were you asleep for? And second, have you heard your parents fighting? And it's clear that Miguel is not a good alibi. Like, this never should have been enough to clear him. And second, there's a lot of problems in this marriage. Like, you get flashbacks of them kind of hitting each other, and it seemed very abusive. And not only that, Miguel says that he actually told parents, or not parents, he told teachers at school about what was going on. And when you think about all the love and support that Henry got from that school because they were such big donors, it kind of makes you wonder why, like, nobody looked into Miguel or kind of looked into the situation, right? Because this was only brought up now. And again, it was enough. Like, I think Haley got some, you know, she was grasping on straws, but after that, it was clear that there was no way Miguel was like awake during the time that this murder happened. And it could also be clear that if the police did investigate this, they kind of were biased towards Fernando. Like, I don't know. You guys let me know. I mean, either way, this did not go over well. Sylvia's happy, so they're kind of having a meeting after this kind of grasping for straws moment, and Fernando comes in and he's kind of like fuck you, like, I hate all y'all, like, you guys are messed up. And if you watch Johnathan in this scene, like, he's still trying to act calm and collected, and he's trying to act like he knows everything, right? Like, he's like Fernando, like, trying to hold him back, like, he's this good guy, but he's obviously not this good guy. Like, he really, like, all of his kind of multiple personalities are starting to show. And Jonathan's commitment is fantastic. Like, he just refuses to, like, he is hanging on for dear life, right? Like, not to let his ugly show. And it shows. Like, Fernando's transparent, but, you know, there's only so much a man can take. Okay, so this moment with Fernando kind of gives Grace an opportunity to volunteer herself for the stand. And this was really interesting because up until this point, she didn't want to do anything. Like, she's kind of barely hanging on. And Haley kind of says what we're all thinking. Like, I don't know what you're thinking, lady. Like, I don't know. Like, I literally don't know what you're thinking. And Grace is like, well, you told me that the jurors, especially the women jurors, can kind of relate to me and this and that. And she kind of pictures herself well enough that, and you could see like Jonathan's face, like, whew, like, thank God, like, you know, like, she really believes who I am. And Haley's instinct was correct. Thankfully, she gets paid regardless. But I remember that thinking that was weird, right? Especially if you look at the way that she's kind of looking at Johnathan, like, she doesn't seem like, she seems like she's trying to hold herself back, right? Like, she really doesn't want to just slap this guy in the face. So she kind of gets what she wants. She gets on the stand, and so far so good, right? Like, Haley kind of gets up there. They talk about how they met. They met in school. They kind of fell in love. And she kind of says, okay, well, you know, maybe he's a cheater, but I know who somebody is fundamentally, and you can't tell me that this is the case. And she kind of gives a typical, like, perfect kind of wife testimony. And Haley's like, okay, cool. And then the prosecutor comes up, and there were so many red flags here that by the end of this, I can't really believe that Sylvia and this prosecutor didn't talk, because some of the questions the prosecutor was asking, you could tell, like how did she know to ask these specific questions, you know? So anyways, so everything is all well and good, and then the prosecutor comes up and she just kind of goes in, right? And she's like, you love him, but the only person who you love more is Henry, right? Like, just right off the bat, kind of making it known that the only person Grace loves more than her husband is her son. And maybe this was kind of like a little like signal, like, listen, this is the time to protect him and you need to throw him under the bus. And again, I think there was some coordination there. And she kind of tells her exactly what Haley told her in the beginning. Like, I can't really wave a wand and undo all this mess. Like, this is not what's happening here. And she kind of goes in on her saying, okay, you're a psychiatrist, you're this and that. And Grace does enough. But I don't know if you noticed, she volunteers like way too much information, right? Like, she kind of rambles on to the point where you're like, sis, like, you need to stop talking. And the one thing the prosecutor did really well, she asked her, like, what is confirmation bias? The idea that people kind of see things as they want and not as they actually are. And the lead up was really interesting because the whole point of Grace's testimony is basically like, I know my husband fundamentally, like, he could have done a lot of things, but he's not a killer. And out of the blue, she's like, well, do you know his family? And I thought that was such a weird question to ask. I'm like, how do you know to ask that question? And then it kind of spiraled, right? So we go from the family to this incident with, if you remember from the last episode, we find out that Johnathan was basically tasked with babysitting his younger sister, but he kind of neglected his duties for a moment, and she kind of ran out on the street and got hit by a car. And this kind of caused an estrangement with his family. And the way the question and answer period was going, I was like, I mean, and then she kind of knew to ask these specific questions, like, have you talked to his parents? She's like, yes, I talked to his mother last weekend. And then what did she say? Well, she said that he doesn't feel neither grief or guilt. And, you know, he never really started the mourning process. And I'm like, how the hell did you know? Because worst case scenario, the prosecutor would have just asked about Johnathan and their past relationship. Like, how she went from there to the family to the death of the child, like, this was a bit much. But the way that Johnathan was looking at Grace, like, you can kind of pinpoint the exact moment where he realized that she was calling his bluff. Like, he looked like he wanted to just get up and strangle her. Like, he was not having it. And I think the nail in his coffin was when the prosecutor basically asked her to define narcissism. And she was like, well, narcissism is two things. The person is grandiose and they lack empathy. And she's like, oh, really? You don't say that they lack empathy. And how do we know that Johnathan lacks empathy? Because his own mother said he lacks empathy, right? And the way she like was phrasing things, it wasn't outwardly at Johnathan, right? Like, there was nothing to attack him. She was just kind of talking about it generally, like kind of excusing Grace. Like, Grace, isn't it that you tell your patients that sometimes in life we kind of unsee things or we unknow things in order to kind of, you know, build up this image, kind of manifest people or ideas into people that are not really there? And, you know, isn't it possible that all these years of having kind of diagnosed it yourself, that you weren't able to see it? You know, like she's kind of doing this hypothetical thing, and Grace is like, I know who I married, but also like, yes, you're 1,000% correct. And I was like, what? I was just like, what is this? And I guess that marks the end of Grace kind of chasing ghosts, right? Like there's what she wants. Like if you remember, her father told her before, like, the reason that Johnathan is so perfect is because you told him what perfect means to you, and he kind of mimics that, right? And other than that, you didn't really see the reality of what was in front of you. You saw what you wanted. That's basically what the prosecutor says, bringing us for a full circle. And that was it. Like Johnathan just gets up, his true colors show. The prosecutor's like yelling, or Haley's like yelling, even though like, I think a lot of Haley's anger was the fact that she knew this would happen deep down inside. But Johnathan just came out, right? He's like, everything was a lie. Everything was this and that. And I appreciate his commitment. Like he really thinks he's, oh wow. So if you weren't sure before, like the moment where we 100% knew he did it is when Johnathan is still throwing his fit, right? He's like, well, she effed us, like, you know, you need to do something about it, like she's done. And Haley just turns around and says, you should have got rid of the hammer. She was in your camp. And that's the point, right? Like Grace was kind of like this the whole time. And she had an image, she kept protecting this image of Johnathan as the good doctor. But the minute he threw their son under the bus, that was it, right? And that's what Haley was saying. She's like, you should have thrown that hammer into the river, because there was just no plausible explanation for that hammer. And he kind of made it worse by blaming Henry. So, you know, Haley just says, like, how stupid can you be? And Haley, not for 1 minute, believed that he was innocent. The way she looked at him was like for her, this was just a challenge to see, like, if she can get this guy off, she can get anybody off. But yeah, that hammer was it. That was the be all end all. And the way she looked at him, I was like, sis, like he really did it. He really did that shit. And after this point, we start getting like flashbacks, specifically of the night of. So we see that Johnathan kind of went over to Elena's studio to have sex. Like clearly he wasn't there to have a conversation with her. Clearly he wasn't there to do anything. Like he was just there. And so we're kind of going back and forth. And I thought kind of the low-key funniest moment was when Henry's like watching the news, and I guess people had been taking bets in like Las Vegas, and I guess people will bet on anything that Johnathan is 100% guilty. And yeah, I mean, it was just looking grim. So we're at the final day of the trial, and it's over. He's going to jail, and he's on the run, right? And he takes his son on this road trip that they've been dying to go on. And during this whole kind of back and forth conversation, we're getting flashbacks, and we finally figure out what happened on the night of. And Henry kind of says straight up, like, you killed somebody. Like, you need to stop running away from it. Like, you need to go home. And the flashback was the most jarring thing ever. Like, I didn't know what to make of it. So they have sex. Johnathan sits down, and Elena kind of says, you know, your wife is really nice. We're getting to know each other. And Johnathan has a temper, right? Because this whole time he kept saying, oh, I really loved her. But this was not love, right? Like this was kind of carnal and primitive. Like he was really just kind of getting what he wanted from her. And he was on his way out. And it was when she said that Henry and Miguel could be kind of brothers that Johnathan wasn't having it. And Johnathan is an interesting dude, because the reason he killed her is because she challenged his authority, right? Like she challenged who had the power. Because he kind of said, listen, if you ever go near my family, I'm going to hurt you. And she challenges him, says, you're never going to hurt me and you're never going to leave me. And that was kind of an ultimatum. And Johnathan, again, is not somebody who's used to suffering. He doesn't hold things over people. You know, he's not the one who has things held over his head. And this kind of challenge to his authority is what snapped, right? Like he kind of bashes her head in, and he's like, does that hurt? Does that hurt? Like, and she's still kind of like, she's like, listen, you're never going to leave me. You're never going to do this. And I think the most jarring moment was when he like threw his keys and he's like, there, I left you. I was like, what kind of savagery, what kind of ratchet behavior is this? Like, what is happening here? Like this whole scene, I'm like, is this real life? Like the way he just threw his keys down, I was like, okay, is that what we're doing? And I guess what had happened is that he was on his way out, and she like grabbed the hammer and she's trying to like kind of hit him, and rightfully so. And he grabs the hammer and he starts bashing her skull in. And I think what's really interesting is that he killed her and then he just left. He didn't clean up the crime scene. He didn't do anything. He just left because it doesn't occur to him that he will ever go to jail, right? Like, he's that privileged. He's just that full of himself. Like, there's no fear. He kills her. He walks out. You know, he has an explanation that he thinks will be like good is good enough. And what that told me is that he really is a narcissist, right? Like, he's really somebody that he just doesn't, you know, this whole thing where he kind of cares about his family and he loved her and he wouldn't have had an affair unless he loved her, is like, he's somebody who's just used to using people, right? Like, he gets what he wants and he leaves. And watching that flashback, the only thing that was clear is that he clearly loved himself, right? And so he's driving, you know, poor Henry along, and Henry's having a heart attack, and, you know, the police and everybody they're kind of looking for him, and he's kind of giving him all this metaphors like, you know, this bridge used to be beautiful and now look at it. And the whole thing with Johnathan is that he's still trying to preserve this image. Like, he does not give up. Like, he still sees himself as this good guy, and that, you know, this was a one-off thing. Like, that's not the real me. That's not the person you knew. You know, this is not the devil you know, right? And his commitment is really something, right? And I think one of the most, I mean, that ending when he was on the bridge, you know, he was never going to kill himself. Like, he's too narcissistic for that. To be honest, like, I was like, you should have thrown the hammer into that river, like, not yourself. But he really plays it up. Like, he really sees himself as the victim. And I think it's just this deeply rooted sickness that this guy has. And so I think the funniest part, or one of the most, like, I don't know, this ending, you guys let me know. And so you see that, like, Edgar Ramirez and everybody kind of comes to arrest him, and the look that Johnathan gives Grace and Henry, like, that was the look of death, right? Like, his true colors came out, and I have nothing to say. Like, that was something. I mean, at the end, he just looked pissed, to be honest. So overall, I thought that was a very good finale. I have nothing, like, it was exactly as I hoped it would be. Like, again, I didn't want them to have, like, a weird multiple personality or some random twist or some, like, they made a commitment. And again, I think the show was really for Nicole and Hugh. Like, I think this was just for them to really act. Like, the script itself wasn't that amazing or memorable, in my opinion, but it was the acting that made it amazing and memorable, and the way they were able to kind of walk the line and kind of keep us on our toes. Honestly, like, I think Nicole and Hugh Grant, they had a lot to work with. They were able to really flex, you know, their acting muscles, and it was really a testament to them. And I was entertained, to be honest. I was thoroughly entertained. It's kind of what we needed, and you guys let me know what you think. But yeah, okay, thank you. And I will see you, I guess, next week. Let me know what you guys want to watch.